We have pulled a truly extraordinary stack of sources today. I mean, it's a really dense collection of articles, strategic analyses, and some seriously provocative political commentary.
Yeah, it really is.
And all of this material, it's focused on one seismic and, frankly, devastating event.
Yeah.
The massive 2025-2026 domestic upheaval that's currently gripping Iran.
Yeah.
But this isn't just about reporting the news. The sources we have in front of us, they're actively arguing about how history should proceed right now in this moment.
That's really the core of our mission today, isn't it? We are diving into a central and, I have to say, an incredibly robust argument that's put forth across this whole stack.
Your chase.
That the current crisis in Iran is not a moment for, strategic caution or quiet diplomacy. They're arguing it's a non-recurring historic moment that demands decisive external action.
A historic moment. That's a heavy term.
It is. And to make their case, the authors are drawing on some really dramatic historical precedents. They're particularly comparing the Iranian situation to two major events. First, the 1971 intervention that led to the creation of Bangladesh. And second, the pivotal fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989.
Wow. Okay, so those are two hugely significant world-changing events.
Exactly. So we really need to unpack this challenging thesis. Why do the sources believe this moment, right now, demands such immediate action? And, what exactly is the blueprint for that action?
Right, and I think before we get into the what to do, we have to understand the why now. The sources, they waste absolutely no time in establishing the gravity of what's happening on the ground.
They don't pull any punches?
Not at all.
Yeah.
I mean, this is not a localized protest. The analysis states that mass protests have been spreading across a staggering 190 cities since late December 2025.
190 cities. Just think about that scale for a second.
It's nationwide. This suggests a deep-rooted civil revolt against the Islamic Republic as a whole.
And the human cost is mounting at a terrifying speed, which gives this entire discussion a profound moral weight. The sources, they detail a rapidly accelerating humanitarian catastrophe.
Right.
So while, generalized casualty estimates are in the thousands, there is one chilling, very specific data point that stands out. It's cited across multiple reports.
What is?
Over 2,000 people were reported dead in a single targeted 48-hour blackout period.
2,000 in 2 days.
In 2 days. During a communications blackout. This indicates concentrated lethal state violence on a massive scale.
That's not suppression. A communications blackout, 2,000 dead. That's a calculated campaign of mass execution.
It's a deliberate effort to decapitate the street movement, to kill the leaders, to instill terror. And this is being accompanied by accelerating mass arrests, public executions designed to terrorize and enforce disappearances.
So for the people arguing for external action, this means the window is closing.
It's narrowing rapidly. They argue that the clock is not just ticking, it's counting down toward an even deeper tragedy if nothing is done.
That urgency, it gives the whole argument for involvement a moral gravity, but also a really dangerous strategic edge. Let's start with that strategic core, because the sources are very, very pointed about the unique opportunity they believe history has presented to the current U.S. administration.
Exactly. And the central thesis, it's framed in these almost poetic but also brutal terms.
How so?
They say that history has presented President Trump with a moment that, and I'm quoting here, does not knock twice.
Does not knock twice.
Yeah. The commentary argues that hesitation in this unforgiving arena of global politics, it doesn't preserve stability. It actively compounds the tragedy. They're framing this current moment as a defining choice, one that will set the tone for the rest of this administration's legacy.
And they even try to quantify the timeline for action, which I found chillingly specific. They claim the optimal moment for intervention has actually already passed.
Right. They say it passed when the death toll crossed 500.
Let's unpack that specific number. Why 500? Why is that the line in the sand for them?
Well, that number isn't arbitrary. It reflects a specific calculus that the source material lays out. 500 deaths, according to this analysis, represents the point where the regime has conclusively demonstrated its willingness to use overwhelming, systematic, lethal force against its own unarmed population.
So it's a threshold of intent.
Exactly. Crossing that 500 death threshold, they argue, signifies that the protest is now an armed state conflict against civilians, not just a political demonstration. At that point, the moral and legal constraints for external intervention become far less ambiguous, especially if you think about frameworks like the responsibility to protect or R2P.
That's a chillingly blunt assessment. It puts a literal expiration date on measured diplomacy.
It really does. So even though they say that optimal moment has passed, they insist the current moment with casualties now in the thousands remains decisive.
Decisive, but much riskier, I'd imagine.
Far more dangerous. The authors note that the alarm bells should have rung across Washington when the toll was at 500. Now, with the escalating rate of killings, arrests, and forced disappearances, that strategic window is narrowing sharply.
So the action required now has to be different.
It has to be dramatically calibrated. It has to empower the people who are already fighting and dying for their freedom before the regime completely crushes the movement. It's no longer about prevention, it's about intervention.
So the argument fuses this moral imperative with a really critical sense of strategic timing. But before we dive into what that action looks like, we absolutely have to address the elephant in the room.
We do.
The paralyzing fear that haunts any discussion of intervention in the Middle East. The sources spend considerable time on this with a very powerful claim. Iran is not Iraq.
This is a crucial pivot point in their argument, and the analysts we reviewed, they dedicated significant energy to dismantling what they call the paralyzing misconception.
The Iraq shadow.
Precisely. The argument is direct. The shadow of the 2003 Iraq misadventure has become an emotional break, an excuse for wholesale inaction, rather than a learned guide for wisdom and calibration.
So they're saying it's a deflection.
It's a deflection that prevents policymakers from assessing the current crisis on its own merits with its own unique context.
And the key distinction they draw is, it's essential. Iran is not looking for a foreign occupation or an imported political system.
They stress this over and over. No one, especially not the millions of protesters facing live ammunition and the gallows, is asking for a replay of the early 2000s misadventures.
You mean massive troop deployments, nation-building projects?
All of that, the subsequent chaos. This moves the entire conversation away from that standard binary regime change versus non-intervention dichotomy that has defined, really, the last 2 decades of U.S. foreign policy.
So if it's not political dissent in the typical sense, what is it? What are the sources calling this?
According to these sources, what we're witnessing in Iran is not merely political dissent demanding better rights. They call it a civilizational reclamation.
A civilizational reclamation. Explain that.
Well, Iran is not a new state. It's one of the world's oldest continuous civilizations. It has a Persian identity, language, history, and cultural memory that predates the 1979 theocracy by millennia.
Thousands of years.
Exactly. So the protest, in this view, is a fundamental rejection of an imposed, foreign-looking political ideology that has suffocated the society for nearly half a century.
That reframes the conflict entirely. It's not just a fight over oil or governance. It's a fight over the fundamental soul of a 2,500-year-old civilization. The sources are arguing that the Islamic Republic is the aberration, not the nation itself.
Precisely. They argue that because the identity of the nation is so much deeper and older than the regime, removing the regime will simply allow the pre-existing sophisticated civil society to surface. The Iranian nation already exists, it's just currently repressed.
And that brings us directly to the first of those powerful historical metaphors you mentioned.
The East Pakistan analogy from 1971.
Right. The comparison of Iran today to East Pakistan in 1971 is certainly jarring, especially when you remember the dramatic end of that conflict.
It is a deliberate and shocking parallel. The sources describe Iran today as an internally colonized nation convulsing under state terror.
Internally colonized.
Yes. The core idea is that the internal pressures, the cultural, linguistic, and economic pressures which pushed East Pakistan toward independence, have a modern analog in Iran today.
Which is?
The pressure from a secular, highly educated, ancient Persian population to shed a theocratic, violent, and economically corrupt ideology.
That's where the analysis of Indira Gandhi's actions comes in. They make a very nuanced claim here. They say her intervention in 1971 didn't create Bangladesh.
But rather, it made its birth inevitable.
Okay. That is a key philosophical distinction.
It's the key to their entire argument. The authors contend that the internal forces driving separation, the Bengali nationalism, the refusal of democracy by West Pakistan, the economic exploitation, had already made the formation of Bangladesh a certainty.
So Gandhi's action.
Her action, while military, simply removed the oppressive apparatus, the Pakistani army, that was preventing the inevitable political outcome. She cleared the way. She didn't build the house, she just unlocked the door.
So the suggestion for Iran is that the internal revolutionary forces are already overwhelming, And external action, if it's calibrated correctly, simply acts as the decisive push.
Yes, it removes the oppressive apparatus, the IRGC and Masih, that is currently preventing the inevitable outcome, the liberation of the people by their own efforts.
So it's about leveraging an existing, powerful internal dynamic. You're not manufacturing an outcome or trying to install a puppet government.
Not at all. If the will of 70 to 80% of Iranians is for secular democracy, as some of these surveys they cite indicate, then the strategic goal is simply to neutralize the minority that is using violence to enforce its will.
Which moves us directly into part 2. The highly detailed blueprint for how this intervention should actually happen. They term it regime collapse by subtraction.
And this is where the source material gets highly operational, very specific. But before detailing the subtraction targets, we have to first address the fear factor, which the analysts fully acknowledge.
You mean the fear of retaliation?
Exactly. They recognize that caution from the U.S. military establishment is not only understandable, but required. Iran possesses extremely credible retaliatory capabilities.
And we are talking about genuine serious threats here. Things like ballistic missile stockpiles, sophisticated drone swarms like the Shaheds.
Right, the cyber warfare units and that sprawling web of proxy militias that stretches from Lebanon through Syria and Iraq all the way to Yemen.
You can't just ignore that.
Absolutely not. The authors emphasize that wargaming and contingency planning for these threats are prerequisites for competence. To ignore Iran's ability to destabilize global shipping or launch proxy attacks would be foolish. But they immediately distinguish between that rational caution and what they call deterrence paralysis.
Okay, what's the difference? How do they define deterrence paralysis?
Well, rational caution, as we said, is competence. It's making sure you know the risks and have a plan. Deterrence paralysis, according to this analysis, is when the fear of escalation becomes an excuse for wholesale inaction.
It turns caution into a moral failure.
That's the argument. They claim we do not need to fear escalating to a full-scale conventional war if the action is sufficiently targeted, precise, and limited to dismantling the internal repression mechanisms. The action must be surgical, not territorial.
And the evidence they use to support the feasibility of this precision model, that's the Israeli precedent.
The Israeli model is central to the viability of this whole strategy. The sources highlight that Israel has for years already demonstrated a durable model for degrading Iranian assets, missile factories, nuclear facilities, key personnel, without plunging the entire region into a full-scale ground invasion.
And avoiding a scenario that will require vast Western resources.
Exactly. They've been conducting these operations for a long time.
So how does this model work in practice? Based on the sources, what are the pillars?
It's built on 3 pillars. First, sustained deep intelligence dominance. You have to know exactly what you're hitting. Second, sophisticated cyber operations that disrupt communication and command structures before a shot is even fired. And third, highly targeted kinetic strikes that avoid civilian infrastructure and collateral damage.
So the blueprint shifts the focus away from conventional war.
Completely. It moves away from taking and holding territory, which is the Iraq model, to precision strikes aimed at neutralizing the infrastructure of coercion.
So we're talking about air power, electronic warfare, and intelligence-led targeting as the key components. It shows it's possible to neutralize a deeply entrenched adversary without deploying mass ground forces or attempting to occupy any territory.
Precisely. And they reiterate the core principles over and over. No mass occupation, no attempt to dictate the successor government, and absolute clarity of purpose.
Which is solely to disable the regime's ability to repress its population.
That's it. The entire goal is to shift the balance of power back to the people on the street and then get out of the way.
Okay, let's get specific then. If the objective is regime collapse by subtraction, what exactly are the subtraction targets? Where do they strike to achieve maximum impact with minimum risk of escalation?
The sources identify 2 precise, non-conventional targets, which they dramatically label the regime's muscles and nerves.
Muscles and nerves.
And critically, these targets are the instruments of internal repression, not the nation's conventional military or basic national infrastructure. These are the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, IRGC, and the Masih militia.
Right. We hear about the IRGC constantly in foreign policy circles, terrorism, missile programs, regional meddling. But the source material, it details their pervasive domestic role in really chilling and necessary detail.
And that's the key. The IRGC is not and has never been a conventional military force tasked with defending national borders in the traditional sense.
They're an ideological enforcer.
They are the supreme ideological enforcers. A revolutionary Praetorian Guard tasked explicitly with crushing domestic dissent and surveilling society. To understand the target, you have to understand their reach.
So what does that reach look like on the ground inside Iran?
It's both economic and military. Economically, the IRGC controls vast empires, estimates suggest they control anywhere from 10 to 30% of the entire Iranian economy.
A third of the economy.
Potentially. They're deeply entrenched in key sectors like telecommunications, construction, energy, and transportation. They use this wealth to fund their apparatus and their proxies abroad.
Militarily.
Militarily, they control weapons depots, sophisticated intelligence networks, and most critically, the command centers that direct the repression on the streets. They are the financial and coercive backbone of the theocracy.
So if you strike at the IRGC...
You are not striking the state of Iran. You are striking the organized crime syndicate that is running the state. That's the distinction they make.
And the Basij militia, they're the street-level enforcer of this syndicate.
They are the domestic terror force, the morality police that enforce cultural and political conformity. They're highly embedded deep within society in neighborhoods, schools, universities, and workplaces.
These are the people with the batons and bikes we see in the videos.
They're the ones who convert peaceful protest into mass slaughter using batons, knives, and live ammunition. They are the eyes and ears of the regime, carrying out arrests and executions on the ground level.
So the core strategic key here is to dismantle their ability to operate as a coherent unit.
That is the exact objective. The plan is to destroy their ability to command, communicate, and control.
What does that mean in terms of targets?
It means precision targeting of IRGC and Basij command and control nodes, their isolated training facilities where ideology is forged into violence, their logistics hubs, and critically, their communications infrastructure that allows them to coordinate rapid responses to protests across all 190 of those cities.
So the goal is simple and kinetic.
It is. Destroy the instruments of repression so that the machinery of tyranny seizes up and the regime is left nakedly exposed, unable to command its forces.
This is where the philosophy of intervention makes that clean break from the mistakes of Iraq and Afghanistan. It's about how the intervention is framed, not just how it's executed.
The sources insist that this operation must be the inverse of Iraq and Afghanistan in both philosophy and execution. The guiding principle must be absolute and unambiguous respect for Iranian sovereignty.
But they make a vital distinction there. They redefine sovereignty.
They do. They argue sovereignty does not belong to the clerics who rule by fear and violence. It belongs to the Iranian people, the nation itself.
Therefore, Washington's role has to be narrowly defined and highly transient.
The goal, as the sources state, must be this: remove the tools of mass repression and step aside. Washington must issue a public and binding commitment not to dictate Iran's future, its constitution, or its leadership.
It's all about creating a vacuum for the indigenous opposition to fill.
Exactly. The result must be regime collapse by subtraction, defined as creating the necessary security space for the indigenous, highly educated, and sophisticated Iranian opposition, that Delta will discuss later, to emerge and govern themselves.
This analysis of the supreme leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, it follows logically from that. The increasing brutality of his regime, the mass executions, the public hangings, is framed not as a display of strength,
but as the endgame of fear.
Right.
That escalating cruelty, the torture chambers, the forced disappearances, is, according to the sources, not a display of secure power. It is a sign of profound, desperate panic.
Because fear can't rule forever.
It can rule for decades, certainly, but the sources argue it cannot rule forever, especially when its legitimacy, morality, and economic competence have totally evaporated in the eyes of the majority of the population.
And they have a very specific, almost clinical view on Khamenei himself, arguing that targeting him personally would actually be counterproductive.
That is a critical point of strategic analysis. The sources state plainly that martyrdom feeds myths, irrelevance kills them.
So if you kill him, you make him a martyr.
You could turn him into a national martyr, strengthening the regime's long-term ideological appeal for a hardcore minority. But if you remove the coercive pillars beneath him, the IRGC and the Basij, his authority evaporates. His decrees become meaningless. His rule becomes historically irrelevant.
The Islamic Republic is ultimately held together by guns pointed inward.
And when those guns fall silent, the analysis suggests the regime collapses under its own systemic weight.
It's a compelling, but incredibly high-stakes strategic argument. Now let's pivot to the deep historical parallel used to frame this moment. Part 3, the 1971 Bangladesh intervention led by Indira Gandhi. The sources are presenting this not merely as history, but as a masterclass in statecraft.
They really are. It highlights how political leaders can, and sometimes must, deliberately shape events rather than merely responding to them. The sources paint a picture of a crisis in 1971 where moral catastrophe and strategic opportunity aligned perfectly.
Much like they argue they do now in Iran. To truly understand the intervention, we have to go back to the origins of the crisis in 1947 when British India was partitioned. The sources describe the fundamental, almost geographical absurdity of Pakistan's initial statehood.
The absurdity was stark. Pakistan was born split geographically into two wings: West Pakistan, which was politically and militarily dominant, and East Pakistan,
Separated by over 1,000 miles of Indian territory.
1,000 miles of a rival nation, and they were bound together only by the fragile thread of a shared faith, Islam, but fundamentally divided by everything else: culture, cuisine, and most critically, language.
Bengali versus Urdu.
Right. And this structural division, it very quickly devolved into systemic economic and political exploitation.
How so?
The West Pakistani military and political elite, who were predominantly Urdu-speaking, consistently marginalized East Pakistan. Despite the East Wing having a larger population and generating significant export revenue from things like jute, the infrastructure investment, political representation, military command posts, all overwhelmingly concentrated in the West.
So East Pakistan was treated, as the sources put it, like an internal colony.
Exactly. They were extracting resources and giving very little back.
And the spark that ignited the whole situation was the 1970 elections.
Yeah.
A democratic result that was simply refused.
Absolutely. When Pakistan held its first truly national and free elections in 1970, Sheikh Mujibur Rahman's Awami League, based in the East Wing, won an outright majority across the entire nation.
So they should have been able to form a government for all of Pakistan.
That's what democracy dictates. But the military junta ruling West Pakistan, led by General Yahya Khan, refused to accept those results. They would not hand over power to a Bengali leader.
And that refusal just dissolved the political bond holding the two halves together.
It confirmed the deep-seated ethnic prejudice that the Bengalis had suspected all along.
And the military response to the inevitable Bengali demands for autonomy was immediate and horrific. That was Operation Searchlight.
On the night of March 25, 1971, the Pakistani army launched Operation Searchlight. This was a campaign of total terror aimed at crushing Bengali nationalism through fear and targeted violence. The sources detail specific and systematic atrocities.
Such as?
Universities were stormed, especially Dhaka University, with intellectuals and students executed immediately. Villages were razed. Mass rapes were used as a systemic weapon of psychological warfare. And critically, the massive Hindu minority in East Pakistan was specifically targeted for wholesale elimination.
So it wasn't counterinsurgency. This was explicitly genocide.
It was collective punishment. It was aimed at eliminating the cultural and intellectual backbone of Bengali identity. The casualty figures for this genocide remain staggering and deeply contested, reflecting the chaotic nature of the conflict.
But the estimates cited are huge.
They range between 300,000 and over 3 million civilian deaths in just 9 months. The scale places it among the worst mass atrocities since World War II and made it impossible for India or the world to just look away.
And the scale of that violence forced the issue directly into India's lap, leading to the refugee flood. This was the humanitarian crisis that became the strategic tipping point for New Delhi.
By mid-1971, the exodus was unprecedented. Nearly 10 million refugees, a population equivalent to a mid-sized European country, had poured into Indian border states like West Bengal, Tripura, and Assam.
10 million people.
And the source emphasizes that this was not merely a moral crisis for Indira Gandhi. It was an unsustainable economic collapse waiting to happen. India, itself a developing nation grappling with massive poverty, was forced to absorb and sustain this enormous displaced population.
The logistical and financial strain must have been absolutely crippling.
It was paralyzing. The cost of permanent relief, shelter, and sustaining 10 million people became calculable, and that led to the blunt strategic conclusion reached by Indian planners, a conclusion that fused strategy with humanity.
Which was?
Intervention, despite the risks of war, would ultimately cost less than permanent relief for the refugee population.
Wow, that is the moment, the moral imperative, ending the genocide, fused perfectly with India's national interest, which was stabilizing its eastern states and permanently weakening a strategic rival, Pakistan.
It established the perfect alignment necessary for decisive action. It cemented Gandhi's resolve, but and this is key, she did not act rashly. Her strategy was complex and phased, demonstrating a level of strategic patience that the sources argue should be studied.
And that included the critical covert support for the Mukti Bahini.
Yes, the guerrilla force, effectively the internal resistance of the Bengalis.
But this was a hybrid strategy.
It was a classic hybrid strategy. A shadow war launched months before the regular army mobilized. Bengali nationalists formed the Mukti Bahini Liberation Force. By May 1971, New Delhi, specifically through its intelligence agency, RAW, was heavily involved. Training, arming, and coordinating this resistance.
And what was the strategic benefit of using the Mukti Bahini? Why not just go in with the army from the start?
Their covert role was crucial for softening the battlefield. They sabotaged Pakistani supply lines, they demoralized forces through constant guerrilla attacks, and they tied down vast numbers of Pakistani soldiers in counterinsurgency operations. This allowed the Indian army to wait for the optimal moment while the Pakistani forces were already isolated, exhausted, and degraded.
So it was a sophisticated use of insurgency by proxy and intelligence dominance.
Absolutely. And that exemplifies what the sources call Gandhi's patience as power. She fought the diplomatic war while the army waited.
Her leadership was defined by strategic patience, not by haste or some emotional reaction.
She understood that success in a conflict like this is won in capitals, in alliances, and on calendars, not just instantly on the battlefield. For instance, her diplomatic moves were very calculated.
What's an example of that?
In July 1971, she publicly started referring to East Pakistan as Bangladesh. This signaled moral recognition and inevitability before formal military recognition. It was a powerful diplomatic step to solidify international legitimacy for the burgeoning state.
And her most critical decision was listening to her military chief, General Sam Manekshaw.
Manekshaw was the voice of pure pragmatism. He advised waiting until December. The reasoning was entirely logistical and geographical. The brutal South Asian monsoon needed to subside.
So the weather was a factor.
A huge factor. The rivers needed to recede, which would allow for reliable trip positioning, vehicular movement, and supply stockpiling. Gandhi listened. She resisted massive internal and external pressure to act sooner, knowing that waiting for the optimal operational window would guarantee success.
And this measured strategic buildup took place against the very dangerous backdrop of the Cold War. The U.S., led by President Nixon and Henry Kissinger, was openly tilting toward Pakistan.
And that was a huge geopolitical threat. They viewed Pakistan as a crucial conduit for their opening to China. Gandhi knew that if India acted unilaterally, it risked a potential intervention from China on its northern border, supported by American political pressure and potentially naval assets.
So she needed an ironclad strategic shield.
She did. And her counterstroke was the brilliant Indo-Soviet Treaty of Peace, Friendship, and Cooperation in August 1971.
That treaty was the strategic masterstroke that secured India's rear. How did it specifically neutralize those threats?
The treaty provided a vital security guarantee. It essentially told China that an attack on India was an issue for the Soviet Union. It neutralized the threat of Chinese intervention.
And the American threat.
Crucially, when the U.S., late in the war, dispatched the USS Enterprise, a nuclear aircraft carrier, into the Bay of Bengal, a clear attempt at gunboat diplomacy, the Soviet Union countered by deploying its own naval assets. It constrained American escalation and reinforced the treaty's protective umbrella.
So India secured its geopolitical flanks and executed its phased strategy before striking, guaranteeing autonomy for the decisive 13-day conflict.
That is the enduring lesson of Gandhi's statecraft. She ensured that by the moment the war began, India held every strategic advantage. The war finally commenced on December 3, 1971, and critically, Pakistan made the first overt move. They launched preemptive airstrikes against Indian airfields.
Which was the political gift India needed.
Absolutely. The airstrikes backfired spectacularly. It instantly provided India with the necessary casus belli, and more importantly, it cemented international legitimacy for its defensive response. The world saw India as responding to aggression, not initiating it.
And the military campaign itself was swift and overwhelming, demonstrating the success of that long, patient, strategic buildup.
Indian forces, executing a coordinated joint campaign with the Mukti Bahini, advanced rapidly. They achieved total air superiority within days, neutralizing the Pakistani Air Force. The Indian Navy blockaded the Bay of Bengal, cutting off all seaborne reinforcements and supplies to Pakistani units who were already demoralized and isolated on the ground.
The whole thing lasted just 13 days.
Just 13 days. It ended on December 16, 1971.
The image of the surrender in Dhaka is still one of the most powerful photographs in modern history.
It marked a historic defeat. Lieutenant General A.K. Nayatsi surrendered to the combined forces, and the scale of the military defeat was immense. Over 93,000 Pakistani soldiers became prisoners of war.
93,000. That's the largest military surrender since World War II.
It is. It's almost hard to wrap your head around the sheer logistical and psychological defeat that represented back in West Pakistan. Bangladesh was born, Pakistan was permanently weakened, and India emerged as the unquestioned dominant South Asian power.
So to summarize the sources' enduring lesson of 1971, when a moral catastrophe and a clear national interest align, hesitation is the most dangerous choice of all.
Gandhi demonstrated that history rewards those who understand when the moment has arrived and act decisively before that opportunity passes. The analysts argue that the current situation in Iran presents a semi-convergence, where neutralizing the IRGC apparatus simultaneously ends a humanitarian crisis and cripples the largest state sponsor of global terror, a clear alignment of moral and strategic interests.
That robust historical comparison brings us back to the present day and the powerful ideological framing of the current crisis, which is part 4. Iran's Berlin Wall.
This is the second key ideological metaphor used by the activists, and it's meant to capture the historic inflection point. The Iranian activist Masih Alinejad has been the most vocal proponent of this framing. She says, "This is Iran's Berlin Wall moment."
And it's an image that immediately suggests a structure of oppression that is internally rotten and just awaiting the final push.
Exactly. But the sources are clear that this wall isn't a physical, concrete structure like the one in Germany. It's a structure of fear and repression.
A wall of repression.
A wall of repression, less visible but equally suffocating and all-encompassing. It's built layer by layer. Compulsory hijab laws, the constant scrutiny of the morality police, omnipresent surveillance both digital and physical, and the institutionalization of fear. The whole system relies on daily humiliation and enforced public silence to maintain control.
And the revolutionary action currently underway is deeply symbolic, yet profoundly destabilizing to the regime.
Alinejad emphasizes the poetic nature of this resistance. She says, Iranian women are tearing it down with their hair, their courage, and their dance. Every visible act of defiance, an uncovered braid, a band song played publicly, a shared video of dance, a discarded headscarf, is described as a hammer strike against a regime that literally governs by controlling women's bodies and dignity.
It really evokes the atmosphere of 1989 perfectly, where the moral authority of the state had completely evaporated long before the physical walls actually fell.
The comparison holds because authoritarian systems ultimately fall when their internal legitimacy vanishes, not when they are negotiated out of existence by treaty. And just as the collapse of the Berlin Wall triggered a domino effect across Eastern Europe, the Iranian theocratic system is at a similar precipice where its founding ideology has become an object of national scorn.
This leads to the crucial question: why does Iran's wall matter globally? The sources argue the Islamic Republic is not just a normal, nasty authoritarian state like many others.
It is, uniquely, an exporter of ideology, violence, and instability. Since 1979, Tehran has perfected and institutionalized the model of state-sponsored terrorism as a foreign policy tool. The system has fundamentally shaped Middle Eastern conflict for over 4 decades, institutionalizing tactics like suicide bombings, rocket wars, and coordinated assassinations abroad.
And this entire export network, the analysis notes, is managed directly by the IRGC.
The sources are very specific on this. The IRGC's Quds Force manages, funds, trains, and arms the key nodes in this global network. We are talking about the highest impact non-state actors in the region.
Like who?
Hezbollah in Lebanon, which controls state policy and maintains a huge rocket arsenal. Hamas in Gaza, a key strategic partner against Israel. The Houthis in Yemen, who currently dominate global shipping lanes. And the network of powerful Shiite militias in Iraq and Syria.
So the argument is that the fall of Khamenei's regime isn't just a domestic political transition, it's a global counterterrorism victory.
That is the unequivocal claim. The fall of the theocracy would, and I quote, starve extremist networks of oxygen. These proxy militias, deprived of reliable funding, sophisticated guidance systems, and ideological direction from Tehran, would weaken substantially.
And long-running, intractable conflicts could enter new phases.
Fundamentally new, less violent phases, from Yemen's civil war to the existential tensions in Gaza and Lebanon.
They're arguing that the ideological engine that normalizes political Islamism and martyrdom over civil life would essentially sputter out.
It would mark a decisive ideological defeat. The sources argue that the consequences of Iran's collapse would be far greater than the fall of the original Berlin Wall because Iran sits at the crossroads of global energy, regional wars, and continent-spanning ideological movements. It would redefine the entire strategic geography of the Middle East.
The regime's global reach isn't a theoretical concept. It's terrifyingly personal for activists like Masih Alinejad. The sources use her experience to illustrate this concept of transnational repression.
Alinejad, who lives under the protection of U.S. law enforcement, has been a direct and high-value target. Her activism, the My Stealthy Freedom and White Wednesdays campaigns, transformed the enforcement of compulsory veiling from a local police issue into a global symbol of state control.
And the regime's response was not just harassment or propaganda.
Not even close. They went far beyond that. The sources confirm multiple, detailed plots to reach her physically on U.S. soil.
What kind of plots?
This includes the foiled 2021 plot to kidnap her in New York and transport her to Iran, and subsequent confirmed threats to assassinate her on U.S. soil. This level of focused, sophisticated intercontinental criminal behavior is the definition of transnational repression.
And why does the source material emphasize this specific detail so heavily?
Because it proves the larger point. Authoritarianism does not respect borders. The regime actively practices transnational repression, exporting fear wherever dissidents flee. For the democratic world, supporting activists like Alinejad is not just a moral good. It is supporting the defense of national sovereignty and the rule of law, even outside Iran's borders.
If the IRGC can plot to kidnap U.S. citizens and residents in New York, the threat is global.
It's a direct threat to the sovereignty of other nations.
So, given these high stakes, what is the cost of silence, according to these sources?
Silence is viewed as enabling the violence. The sources argue that the Berlin Wall fell because of sustained political, economic, and moral pressure, not quite diplomacy or engagement with the regime. As protesters face lethal force and accelerating executions, the sources suggest that the measured, cautious silence from Western capitals is not interpreted as prudence in Tehran.
It's seen as tacit approval.
Or at least a lack of will to act. The protesters are asking for alignment, not intervention in the old sense.
What do they mean by alignment?
They are asking the democratic world to stop legitimizing their jailers. They want the West to treat the Islamic Republic as the criminal enterprise it has become, not as a normal government you can negotiate with.
And this call for alignment translates directly into specific non-military strategic pressure points that activists are demanding.
Yes, and the sources lay out a clear hierarchy of these non-military demands.
Let's enumerate those. What's at the top of the list?
First, aggressive and comprehensive expulsion of regime diplomats and the coordinated freezing of assets belonging to IRGC-linked entities and officials abroad. Second, and often considered the most crucial, the global designation of the IRGC as a terrorist organization by key democratic allies.
What else?
Coordinated sanctions and total diplomatic isolation, treating their embassies as nodes of terror financing and espionage. And finally, the element of information warfare.
Right, breaking the blackouts.
Exactly. They emphasize the critical role of information dominance. When the regime institutes blackouts, the world must counter. That means aggressive support for free internet access via Starlink and other satellite technologies.
So protesters can coordinate and, crucially, share evidence of the regime's atrocities with the outside world.
It's all about applying pressure from every possible angle until a system cracks.
That's a comprehensive political and strategic framework. Now we have to move to part 5, the cultural battleground. The core, visible symbol of this decades-long repression is the hijab itself, which is described as a political weapon.
The compulsory veil is not merely a religious mandate in Iran. It is the most visible, enforced symbol of the state's control over the private life and dignity of its citizens. The evolution of the hijab from a post-1979 decree to a compulsory symbol of control, enforced with what the sources call the subtlety of a sledgehammer, is central to the current uprising.
The regime decreed that women must cover every inch of skin and hair. That mandate became the central flashpoint for this civilizational revolt.
It did, and the tragic catalyst that ignited the 2025-2026 uprising is directly traced back to the 2022 death of Mahsa Amini.
Mahsa Amini was arrested for what the morality police deemed a bad hair day, a few strands of hair showing beneath her mandatory head covering.
And she subsequently died in custody. Her death was the spark that violently reignited decades of simmering resentment. Her tragedy catalyzed a movement where women began publicly removing their scarves, filming their defiance, and sharing it globally.
It transformed what began as a protest against a piece of cloth into a profound national rejection of the entire regime's ethos.
It really did. And the regime responded, as expected, with increasing severity, culminating in the highly punitive 2024 hijab and chastity law.
This law represents a massive escalation in state cruelty.
It dramatically increased the penalties for noncompliance. It imposed massive fines, reportedly as high as £12,500, along with the potential for jail time or even flogging for repeated offenses.
The message from the state is unambiguous. Comply or suffer severe economic, physical, and legal punishment.
This law demonstrates the regime's panic and its total reliance on institutionalized cruelty to maintain control over half the population.
But the people are rejecting this imposition almost unanimously.
Yeah.
We have polling data that speaks volumes about the depth of this cultural rejection.
We do. Independent polling suggests a huge, overwhelming majority. Somewhere between 72% and 80% of Iranians across various demographics demand freedom of choice regarding the hijab.
The principle is simple.
It is. They want the right to wear it if they choose to do so as an act of personal faith, but not because the state mandates it under the threat of violence. This massive rejection strikes directly at the heart of the ideological foundation of the Islamic Republic.
Because it relies on those visible symbols of piety for its legitimacy.
Exactly. And the sources highlight how these specific cultural demands are fused seamlessly with overwhelming economic grievances.
The scale of the unrest, the 190 cities involved, is due to this fusion.
It's not singular. It blends issues like hyperinflation, the crashing currency, crippling poverty, encapsulated in the cry, "I can't afford bread," with the deep demand for personal autonomy articulated as, "Stay out of my wardrobe."
When both your wallet and your dignity are being attacked by the state, the platform for revolution is incredibly robust.
It is. And we can't overlook the specific political slogans that reject the regime's foreign focus.
The chant, "Not Gaza, not Lebanon, I give my life for Iran."
That is perhaps the sharpest distillation of the people's priorities. It shows a population that is explicitly pushing back on the regime's 4-decade-long policy of exporting ideology and violence abroad while domestic needs crumble. They are insisting that their domestic freedoms and national priorities matter first.
The protest is about reclaiming their national focus and resources from the IRGC's global ambition.
Exactly. And this nationalistic impulse leads us to the final and arguably deepest part of this cultural battleground section, the idea of Iran's eternal dawn, the conflict between the modern theocracy and the ancient Persian soul.
This is where the analysis elevates the conflict to a civilizational level.
It is. Iran is a civilization that does not easily perish. It endures. Its roots stretch back over 2,500 years to the Achaemenid Empire under Cyrus the Great. The Islamic Republic, imposed in 1979, is, in this sweeping historical view, merely a brief, violent footnote in this millennia-spanning story.
The sources remind us of the key historical reference points that define this ancient identity and why they resonate with today's youth.
They point to Persepolis, the magnificent ceremonial capital built by Darius I, which symbolizes an era of vast multicultural empire, innovation, and relative tolerance. They note the flourishing of Zoroastrianism there, with its emphasis on ethical dualism, free will, and human agency principles that profoundly influenced global philosophies, predating Islam by centuries.
And protesters are often sharing imagery of these ancient symbols.
They are, implicitly contrasting the grandeur of their past with the drab, violent strictures of the present regime.
Even after the Arab conquest in 651 CE, Iran didn't simply become a mirror of its conquerors. It strategically Persianized Islam.
This is a critical historical resistance point. Iranians infused the faith with their deep cultural heritage. Sufi mysticism, the poetic elegance of national figures like Rumi and Hafez, and a distinct Shiite theological character. This synthesis was a subtle internal resistance to ideological absolutism,
planting deep cultural seeds for skepticism toward rigid imposed dogma.
Seeds that are now flowering in the rejection of the Ayatollahs. And the modern manifestation is the growing distinction among protesters between the permanent nation, Iran, and the temporary structure, the Islamic Republic.
Protesters increasingly view the Islamic Republic as an occupying force that hijacked their ancient civilization and draped it in a foreign-looking, fundamentalist, political framework.
Yes, they are drawing heavily on Persian nationalism, with some invoking the exiled crown prince Reza Pahlavi as a symbol of pre-revolutionary continuity. This is fundamentally about shedding an imposed ideology in favor of their original enduring national identity.
And we see that deep rejection reinforced by the latest demographic surveys.
The surveys reinforce this massive disconnect between the state and the people. 70–80% of Iranians across all key demographics, urban, rural, educated, reject the theocracy in favor of a secular democracy.
This suggests that the theocratic regime no longer represents the cultural or political essence of the nation.
The goal, according to the sources, is not a new form of religious rule, but a final, definitive evolution toward a pluralistic future where Islam recedes as a state ideology and becomes a personal faith within a secular framework.
That sets the stage for the crucial and most complex question: leadership. If the wall cracks and the regime falls, who leads the transition? Part 6 maps this terrain, describing the opposition not as a monolithic force, but as a delta.
The sources characterize Iran's opposition as a delta branching, chaotic, sometimes colliding, rather than a single unified river. It's fragmented, which reflects the deep national pluralism monarchists, various shades of Republicans, secular liberals, Sunnis, ethnic minorities.
And this fragmentation is both a weakness and a strength.
It's a weakness because it makes coordination difficult, but it's a strength because it reflects the deep desire for a pluralistic, non-authoritarian future.
And the crucial insight provided here is that leadership may emerge after the wall cracks, not before.
That's the strategic forecast. No single figure currently commands the universal allegiance required to lead a unified provisional government. However, a constellation of highly influential voices is actively shaping the discourse, preparing infrastructure, and defining the ethical and political boundaries for the coming collapse.
So we need to look closely at these competing centers of power. Let's start with the exiled symbol, Reza Pahlavi. He occupies a unique and paradoxical position.
As the son of Iran's last monarch, the Shah, he represents the idea of pre-revolutionary continuity, a potent symbol for those who remember the relative secularism and global integration of that era. And crucially, the sources describe him as a symbol without blood on his hands, having been in exile since childhood.
This distance allows him to modernize the concept of monarchy. He's not demanding a traditional monarchical restoration by decree.
Correct. His modernized position calls not for restoration, but for a referendum, allowing Iranians to choose their system of governance freely, whether that's a constitutional monarchy, a republic, or something else. His rhetoric focuses heavily on non-violent civil resistance and, importantly, encouraging military and security defections.
So he's emphasizing internal collapse rather than foreign usurpation.
Very much so.
What's his greatest asset and his biggest challenge?
His greatest asset is the politics of memory invoking a glorious secular past, but that is also his biggest challenge. He represents what came before, and many younger Iranians view the monarchy as another form of repression, just a secular one. He needs to convince the public that he is merely a symbolic bridge to a genuinely democratic future, not a power seeker.
Okay, next is the organized disciplinarian, Maryam Ravi, leading the MEKN-SFI. She represents an entirely different kind of power structure.
If Pahlavi embodies symbolic legitimacy, Rajavi embodies organizational discipline and infrastructure. The MEK, operating under the umbrella of the NCRI, is the most structured opposition movement. They operate with the rigor of a shadow state from their bases in France.
They maintain a clear leadership, aggressive international lobbying,
and a claimed network of underground operatives inside Iran.
What is their proposed alternative government?
Their platform is a rigorously defined, secular, democratic republic. They explicitly reject both monarchy and clerical rule. Rajavi claims that the regime is already hollowed out from within, asserting significant defections inside the security services and even the IRGC.
So their greatest claim is organizational readiness.
That's right. If the regime falls suddenly into a vacuum, the MEK may be one of the few groups prepared to move fast due to its paramilitary structure and organization.
However, the sources must acknowledge the deep distrust many Iranians feel toward the MEK. This is an essential point of friction.
That distrust is profound, and it stems from the organization's controversial history. This includes armed struggle, which has alienated many peaceful activists, and reports of cult-like internal discipline and ideological rigidity.
And their historical alliance with Saddam Hussein during the Iran-Iraq War.
That makes them highly suspect to many ordinary Iranians. Therefore, Her role is less about mass appeal inside Iran today and more about having a ready organization for a rapid, chaotic transition scenario.
Then we have Narges Mohammadi, the moral authority behind bars, the Nobel Peace Prize laureate. Her power is uniquely derived from suffering.
If the opposition has a conscience, it is Narges Mohammadi. She represents resistance from within the Islamic Republic's most brutal prisons, where dissent is literally meant to suffocate and die. Her tireless activism against the death penalty, torture, and gender apartheid makes her one of the most respected voices among Iranian civil society and the international community.
She doesn't have an army or an economic empire, but her power is pure moral legitimacy.
Despite repeated imprisonment, isolation, and deliberate medical neglect, she issues powerful statements, often smuggled out at great personal risk, calling for a peaceful transition away from the Islamic Republic. She doesn't command militias or political parties, but she defines the ethical boundaries of a post-theocratic state.
Her moral authority is immense, and such figures often define what comes next by setting the standards of justice and accountability.
Exactly.
Finally, we turn to Masih Alinejad, the diaspora megaphone, whose role is translating street anger into global policy.
Alinejad is the force that internationalizes Iran's struggle. Her early life and career were defined by a pattern of truth, followed by retaliation, expelled from high school and college, banned from parliament as a journalist. Her move to the West led to the creation of the My Stealthy Freedom campaign in 2014.
And that created a massive, unprecedented digital movement of defiance, evolving into White Wednesdays.
Yes, and her power lies in narrative warfare, which is a key component of this deep-dive strategic argument. She translates the whispers of resistance inside Iran into thunder abroad, using digital platforms as modern samizdat.
And she focuses relentlessly on targeted policy demands for Western audiences.
Calling for IRGC designation, targeted strikes, and maximum diplomatic pressure. She doesn't claim to lead the revolution. She insists she is amplifying voices that already exist, which is why the regime views her as such a dangerous threat.
The sources acknowledge the opposition is broader than these four key figures, demonstrating the sheer breadth of that delta.
Yes, we have to briefly mention a few more points of pressure. Maulana Abdul Hamid, a prominent Sunni cleric in the Baluchistan region, is openly condemning state violence. This challenges the regime's fundamental claim to Islamic legitimacy, especially among the rest of Sunni minorities.
And Mustafa Tadzadeh,
A former reformist interior minister turned jailed dissident. He symbolizes the complete collapse of faith and the possibility of gradual reform within the Islamic Republic system.
So the conclusion here is that fragmentation, while messy, reflects the deep pluralism that any post-theocratic Iran will have to negotiate.
The current regime holds the guns, but the opposition holds the future. When legitimacy drains away, power eventually follows, which brings us to the synthesis of the entire strategic argument in Part 7.
Let's return to the strategic argument and the Trump-Reagan comparison, suggesting President Trump stands at a Reagan-esque inflection point, analogous to the Berlin Wall moment in 1987.
This source material draws a powerful historical line. Reagan's legacy was built on moral clarity and sustained strategic pressure, coining the term evil empire and demanding, Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall, which ultimately revealed communism's fundamental vulnerabilities.
Similarly, the current administration is positioned, according to the sources, to accelerate the collapse of the Islamic Republic,
which activists frame as the end of political Islamism's most influential playbook since 1979.
And President Trump has issued very stark public warnings if the mass killings continue.
He has warned that if Iran continues to kill protesters, the U.S. will hit them at levels they've never been hit before. While Iranian officials predictably denounced this as reckless warmongering, the sources present this as a clear pathway to an iconic legacy of liberation, echoing Reagan's resolve without requiring an invasion.
So the threat of a kinetic strike, if delivered with precision, is viewed as the necessary pressure point to trigger the internal collapse.
That's the argument. The final synthesis is the specific choice: immediate, decisive, and precise action.
Centered entirely on surgical intelligence-led strikes on the critical infrastructure of the IRGC in Basij.
Key missile sites, manufacturing facilities for weapons like the Shahed drones, and crucial command centers. These are surgical blows designed to neutralize the machinery of repression, thus empowering the indigenous protesters to finish the work they have already begun: the collapse by subtraction.
And the predicted outcome of success is massive, extending far beyond Iran's borders. It's presented as a global geopolitical shockwave.
The sources claim that success would result in a profound global ripple effect, a positive disruption of decades of regional conflict. It would fundamentally cripple the proxy networks, cutting off the oxygen supply to groups like Hezbollah and the Houthis.
This, they argue, would redefine the Middle East's geopolitical landscape and mark the ideological defeat of state-sponsored terrorism.
And diaspora rallies in Berlin and London are already amplifying this call, viewing the moment as the end of an entire epoch, much like 1989.
Before concluding, we have to address the fundamental fear the regime propagates to maintain control. The vacuum myth. The idea that without the clerics, Iran would descend into chaos, like Libya or Syria.
The sources robustly debunk this myth. They argue the opposite is overwhelmingly likely. Iran is not a failed state. It possesses a highly educated population, particularly women, a sophisticated civil society, and a vast diaspora of technocrats, academics, and entrepreneurs ready for reconstruction.
The system may be rotten at the top, but the underlying national fabric is strong, so power won't flow to extremists or warlords.
It will flow organically from within to those ready to rebuild. The analysis is clear. Regime change, in this specific case, would not need to be imposed. It would emerge organically and irresistibly from within once the coercive pillars of the IRGC and Masih are removed.
The sources view this as a rare moment, a clear path towards securing a legacy of liberation with minimal long-term external commitment, provided the initial action is decisive and constrained.
It's a huge claim.
We have covered an immense amount of complexity today, from the devastating humanitarian crisis on the ground in 190 cities to the detailed strategic call for regime collapse by subtraction, all framed by the historical weight of the 1971 Bangladesh intervention and the 1989 Berlin Wall moment.
This deep dive has really highlighted the profound and, well, rare confluence of moral and strategic opportunities that the source materials is presenting. The authors believe history is knocking loud and clear in Iran.
And the core question for external powers, particularly the U.S., is whether they will choose to empower a people already fighting for their freedom by removing the tools of their repression, or whether they will look away.
The tragic consequence of looking away, as argued by activist Masih Alinejad, is that the wall of repression just grows taller, bloodier, and harder to dismantle. The sources argue that the moment, despite the immense risks, has arrived.
And that leaves us with a final provocative thought for you, the learner.
If Iran, one of the world's oldest continuous civilizations, successfully reclaims its 2,500-year-old Persian identity over the comparatively brief footnote of the 1979 theocracy, what other nations currently defined primarily by modern imposed political ideologies, be they communist, extremist, or fundamentalist, might also undergo a similar civilizational reclamation in the 21st century?
The idea of Iran's eternal dawn suggests that deep cultural identity often outlasts and ultimately sheds temporary political systems. Something to think about.